studio thinking and critical thinking, support for reflective thinking. In this presentation, you're going to be introduced to a lot of new ideas. And it is important for me to let you know where these ideas come from. These are not ideas that come from books I've read, although I've done the usual amount of enormous reading in the field. But this is a presentation that attempts to fill in what isn't out there. And so there's only one place that it can come from, and that's from our own practice. And so this comes from the practice, my own practice as an artist, as a botanical artist, and also from my work as an external evaluator in arts integration projects, where other teachers and artists and artist teachers are working together to try to solve these problems through their practice. We're also using as the spine of our work the work of Lois Hetland with studio thinking. And so we're going to use this as the spine of what we're talking about today. We're going to be referencing the things that people have discovered in practice. Throughout the work in Berwyn and before that for years at the Chicago Teachers Center with Arts at the Center, we have been interested in reflective thinking and metacognition as it relates to teaching practice and learning. One of the things that I'll be emphasizing today is the process of internal verbalization. And internal verbalization is the process in our minds that accompanies action, thinking, and process. And it's particularly crucial for creative thinking. For many people, the way this internal verbalization starts is through the assignment of words to the mental images that actually are the backbone of our thinking process. And we learn very young to assign words to the mental images that our brain uses to store our experience. We analyzed all 91 units that were complete units from the Arts Berwyn years for metacognition. We took the data from journal entries by both students and teachers that were aligned with the studio thinking. And one of the things that became evident as we reviewed these journals was that students needed a vocabulary. They needed to develop a vocabulary. First, to feed their internal verbalization. And second, to become a part of their expressive verbalization. When teachers didn't do this, when they just gave them a journal and said, fill it in, they didn't get much. It was good. I was happy. And we'll be talking later about what we really like to see in terms of a more complete verbalization. So what the teachers did is that they worked with students to build up the vocabulary. And they did this in a variety of ways. Sometimes they did it through one-on-one conversation, where they would ask the students to revisit their work and talk about it and reconstruct the process. Sometimes they did it in small groups. Sometimes students did it in pairs with one another. But that was really more about applying the earlier work in verbalization. And sometimes they did it through writing. Especially in the younger years, the younger classes, the K through 3 classes, the teachers would revisit the art experience with the students, and they would construct sentences that would include all of the new vocabulary that they were generating through these experiences. And another thing that we learned was that art experiences generate rich vocabulary in students. This was a massive discovery. The other thing that teachers and artists did together that seemed to really boost the metacognition that was going on in the classroom was that they created strong visual experiences to jumpstart the verbalization and the vocabulary. We came to call a lot of these preliminary experiences notation. And we're not going to be talking a lot about notation in this presentation, but in the future we will be. This is just a review of the 8 studio habits that Lois Hedlund and a team of researchers generated. But if you're not familiar with her book, Studio Thinking, you should know that these come out of the practice of art teachers, visual art teachers, in art academies in the Boston area. And that they are based on extensive video observations and observations with instruments that develop things like timelines for classrooms. So they don't come out of artificial situations that are constructed, say, in an experimental model, but they actually come out of the practice of teachers. I want to show you a few examples of developed craft, which is the first studio habit that we'll be talking about. This is from a first grade classroom. And I would say it's neater than most of the other examples we had, but it's typical of the other examples. And you can see how the new vocabulary is showing itself in this student journal. The vocabulary is used as notation and schema. And I would ask you to take a look at the detail that shows that the ability to visualize in their own imagination detail and to represent it graphically is far beyond their verbal vocabulary. And also that this vocabulary that is an advanced vocabulary is taken from the instructional method. So the vocabulary is building up in 2 ways. It's building up from the instructional method, where it's coming from the teacher and the artist as they are creating vocabulary that pertains to the materials and the process. And then as they actually do work and make art, their reflection creates the internal verbalization, and they share this vocabulary and generate vocabulary together. So there's two places that the new vocabulary comes from. That we begin to develop expectations for this verbalization portion that accompanied the practice of art. And in a simple way, it broke down into 3 layers. It begins with I did. And that is to simply reconstruct the physical activity and also any mental activity that they would put into a description or recreation from their memory of what happened. And it's done from the personal perspective. They're not talking about the teacher did. They're not talking about the other students. But as you'll see later, actually, the I not only became what they did when they were doing their assignment, but it became how they were responding to the presence of the teacher, how they were responding to the other students and what they were doing. And it made it very clear to us in terms of the atmosphere and the situation of metacognition that it wasn't just working on the assignment. It was being in a whole environment and responding to all of the stimuli around them. The second layer is I used, where they talk about their materials. And then the third is I felt, which would be focusing on their response to the experience as a personal experience. We came to think of this as a template for the starting point for metacognition. That it was not very long or deep into the process before almost every student could verbalize it. Not every student could write it, but they could verbalize it. They could tell you what happened, they could tell you the materials that they used, they could tell you how they responded to it. And what the teachers began to do was look for these 3 layers, and they did this intuitively. And then part of their dialogue with the students was to prompt them if the students on their own metacognition left off one of these layers. So that the teacher was listening and making sure that the students were verbalizing on all 3 layers. I'm going to stay with this first grade class because I want to show you what the next step would be. Because a lot of people think, well, you can't really do this with very young children. And these are first graders. And by the way, half of the students in this class were special ed. And all of them were able to do this. And I think in part because of the preliminary work that their teachers did with them, building the vocabulary. What this student is doing is that she's going to the verbal level. She is able to actually start to talk about one of those layers, which is the second layer I used. I used oil pastels, and she tells you why to color in the pictures. I used watercolor to fill in the parts that are not colored in. Now that sentence is highly contextualized. In a minute, I'm going to show you a picture that will give you the context for that. I use scissors to cut and use glue also to stick it onto the paper. So this is a step beyond just simply naming the materials. This student is actually using the materials, telling you how they're using them and to what purpose. And this is actually a first step toward critical thinking. When you can begin to say what materials you're using and what it is that you want to achieve by doing it, when you can see that connection between your action and the anticipated result, that is a step of creative thinking that is critical and crucial. And it's very complicated. If you stop and think about it, you could parse out all of the different pieces that go into that one simple set of making the connection between what you do and what happens. And you can see that the student who's able to do that is also able to do a very interesting thing in the representation in the drawings. Like the other student, this student assigned the vocabulary. The student also made very detailed drawings. But she does two things in the center that are different. In the center on the right, she has watercolor. She has the set of actual watercolors. But she has a drawing of the water of glass with the brush in it. And this is going beyond iconic schema. This is representing the relationship of those materials. To the left, you can actually see that she's put herself into the picture. She is drawing on an easel. And if you look carefully in the center of the drawing, you see the drawing she is making. So that tells us that in her mind, she has this clear image of herself as agent, of herself as painter. And those two images show a real step toward where a student has to go in order to begin to think about what it is that they're doing. And that tells us that she has those mental images and that sense of the relationship that is three-dimensional that she's drawing upon when she tells us about her project. Now, because art making is a process, the metacognition began to become a sequence of actions, not just one isolated incident. And so a next step that students were able to take was that they were able to go from the first maybe notation section, then the next thing that they did, then the next thing they did, and for each one, respond with all three layers. And again, most students in the classrooms were able to do this verbally in a short period of time. So if we go to the next studio habit, which is envision, we're really entering into a habit of mind. A habit of mind which is the ability to consider something through visual imagery that is in our head. And what's amazing about the human brain is that not only can it retrieve visual images from memory, but it can also conjure up visual images that don't come and have never been. And this is essential to critical thinking. The ability to envision. Well, critical thinking is not possible without the ability to envision. If all you're doing is looking backwards at the memory of something, you can never start to consider all of those important elements of creative thinking that are about the future. So, verbalization of envisioning is really scaffolding and helping students to fill in their envisioned visual imagery. So just as before they talked about I did, now they can talk about I could. And then they would talk about what they are mentally envisioning. Just as they talked about I used, now they could talk about I would use. Just as they talked about I felt, now they could talk about I am feeling. And when teachers or their classmates were accompanying this envisioning process, they would make sure that all three of these levels were there. So that the teacher, if the student is saying, I could make a spaceship, and then if they, I'm really excited about that, and I want it to have 22 windows. And if that's all the student says, then the teacher might say, well, what materials would you use? What do you want to make a spaceship out of? You see how this conversation is scaffolding by those three layers. This is very basic, but it's laying the ground for the future. The problem with the previous slide is that it makes it all seem very linear. It looks like the sequences are just linear, and there's a beginning, there's an end, and there's one way to get from the beginning to the end. This is the way art is often taught, with steps that every student goes through to get to the end. But it's essential for the critical process that students consider more than one possibility, and that they be prompted to consider more than one possibility, and then choose not only between the three layers, but among possibilities. And so it's just important to remember that it is a nonlinear process. As you go deeper into this metacognitive dimension, you begin to make a discovery. Students begin to make a discovery. And that is that actually you are envisioning all the time. You are envisioning at every stage. You are envisioning what else you could be doing. What would you be doing next? All of the time. And at some point, students begin to realize this. And it shows up in the journaling. So that they will tell you that while they were doing this, they had an idea for that. And while they were using this color, they noticed that they didn't really like it that much, and they thought, I could use that color. Or I could add pebbles. Or I could do this 3D. All of that is the kind of thing that happens all the time. And this is where we really want people to get. We want people to begin to realize that this metacognition track is actually active in a critical thinking way all the time. And as we become aware of it, we can actually add dimensions of critical thinking to all phases of our work and what we do. So it's not a thing where now we're going to do creative thinking. It's not a thing where we say, now we have all of these things that we do, and now let's take that leap and do creative thinking. Actually, the creative thinking is part of the ongoing process. It's important to remember that all of these mental images that are in our mind have hardwired into them feelings. We know this about the brain and how it works. The brain does not serve up anything that is not encoded with the feelings of the origin of that image. So whatever you were feeling or smelling or uncomfortable about, when the thing you remember is remembered, you get all of it. You get the whole package when it comes up. And so we've got to develop an awareness of the feelings that go with the images and not just deal with the images. We've got to realize that these things, we didn't used to know this about the brain, but brain research has shown that that's the way it works. And so we've got to talk about the feelings. We've got to ask about the feelings. We've got to bring that awareness, because as human beings, we don't do that. We deny the feelings, and then we get into all kinds of trouble because we go forward with mental images laden with feelings that stay there that we don't want to recognize or acknowledge. Now, one of the things that we can do as visual artists, and as really any kind of artist, is to work with children to develop their verbalization. In theater, they have developed, thousands of games and ways of doing this. But we don't have those yet for the visual arts. We work with materials, we improvise with materials, we explore materials, but we don't work with children to develop imagery and verbalization. And this is an example of a visualization that we've developed at Arts at the Center to just be an example of this. And it's something that we've used in our professional development as a bridge into some experiences with improvisation and visualization. Okay, let's talk about observe. Observe is a place where art history and the visual arts have an enormous amount to contribute. It is also a direct link to scientific thinking and to critical thinking. Because if you don't have good properties of observation and you're trying to do critical thinking, you're doing it from an impoverished basis. And so the ability to observe is something we know a lot about, and it's something that we can contribute a lot from. In the visual arts, The observe lens is often used preliminary to starting making your artwork. A sketch, just looking carefully at something. In art history, the close read is an example of using and creating notation. If you are writing down, for example, all of the students' ideas of summarizing what they see and then all of their inferences about what it might mean and be about, that's notation. The purpose of observation is usually not only to awaken our awareness, to become more adept at seeing and seeing more, but it's also to make a record. And the record that we make is something that we can use going forward. So a sketch would be a perfect example of that. A sketch where you encode all the things you want to remember going forward. You write down what color, the exact color that you can. Sometimes you can use notations if you have your paint with you, and you can mix up the paints and actually put in a swatch of the color that you want. That's all notation. In arts integration, so many units use sketchbooks and portfolios. That was really where the student brought together consciously the connection between the art and the other classroom content material. And that's where they kept, as an auxiliary memory, all of the things that they had done. We're all familiar with schema that we can use to draw a face. And so these students were doing portraits of historic people. And these are second graders. And they learned a schema. And this is just an example of a student working with the schema, trying to imagine a face. And this second grader, who, by the way, this was a bilingual classroom, and she was writing in English. They write in both languages. We used an upside-down egg for a head, and we separated the face with lines, and we made ears from one side to the other. So what we can see here is that she is able to describe how she is using the schema, and she sees the relationship between the right and left ear when she says, made ears from one side to the other. This student sketched Rosa Parks 11 times. The children were asked to go home and sketch 5 sketches every night. And she was sketching lots of other things, like her siblings and her parents and her auntie and all of that. But this was one of her series on Rosa Parks. And each one shows something else that she observed using the reference photos that she received of Rosa Parks when she selected Rosa Parks to be her portrait. The important thing about observe is that it gathers information and it also slows down the process. And just like envision is ongoing, we began to see that observation is ongoing. That while you are deep into your project, it's step 3, you're still observing. And if you have those records, you can go back and you can use those records. Or if you have the model there for you, you can observe it directly. Or you might have to go to other reference materials and look at them and observe there in order to solve a problem. So the ability to observe and to collect and add new information as part of problem solving and is part of critical thinking. I love this quote, that slowing down to think things through allows us to solve problems and upgrade our consciousness, our unconscious, reactive decisions for more thoughtful strategies and deliberate tactics. That quote is describing critical thinking. Now, in the earlier student habits, we talked about 3 layers. The I did, I used, I felt. Express is when we use those 3 layers intentionally with the materials that we are working with. So I did becomes technique. And I used becomes the materials that I use, but not just like those schemas we were looking at earlier, but the properties of the materials, understanding the materials, developing what that one girl did when she linked the materials that she used with the outcome she wanted. All of that is part of Express. It's the intentionality of it. And then the I felt is where all of those feelings become a message. The message that you want the person who looks at your work to receive. The thing that's important to you to share with other people. You can't have artistry or intentionality without metacognition about what you want to express. You just can't. I like this journal entry by this 4th grader because it captures the way the feelings are there in his work. And his recognition that his feelings are about his message and his feelings are about who he is and what he knows. And that those 2 things are connected to his subject, which is the natural world. That triangle of the subject, the message, and the child is really what should be in all of their work. Engage and persist. These are really 2 halves of a whole. I've done a lot of reading about this. And you see here a definition of discipline. And that comes from the way we usually think of engage and persist. That, you discipline yourself, and the idea of a discipline or a practice with your art. In brain research, there is this important concept of executive function. The way I understand that the brain works is that these functions are actually clusters within the brain. And all of these clusters activate other areas of the brain toward a purpose. So if you don't have these clusters developed, it's very difficult for you to act toward a purpose. Now, what is interesting to me about these clusters is that these align so well with the things that we heard all the time about children in classrooms using arts when they were studying other content areas. We heard all the time about how the arts seemed to be giving them a way to organize what they knew. We heard constantly about how suddenly students who were all over the place could focus. And in fact, focus was a vocabulary word that came up over and over and over, almost from the very beginning, where students would talk about, I need to focus. They were monitoring their ability to focus. And all of this was coming up like gangbusters in the journals. That students are alert. That while they were doing their art activity, they just were so aware of everything. That they would stay with something for long periods of time. Students who usually would, make an effort, quit, and they were done, were now sticking with it for long, extended periods of time. Students who really were out of control a lot of the time were working so hard to manage their emotions. That was especially evident in theater, where the theater artists would be working with them about emotions, and they would be working with how to express them and how to control their body and how to control their face and how to use their body and face to intentionally express something. And that just opened up a whole new world for kids in terms of understanding what they did and how that went with what they felt. And using a working memory so that you can develop a process. And self-regulation. I mean, if you want to draw and if you want to paint, you have to learn how to regulate the materials. You have to. It's just inherent. I'm just skimming the surface. But this executive function is critical to critical thinking. It's critical to almost anything else. It's critical to problem solving. And whether you know it or not, if you're an art teacher, you know a lot about developing executive function for children. You may not call it that. You may have a whole other way of understanding it, but that's what you're doing. Students, because of this studio habit, students wrote a lot about engage and persist. We learned a lot about this engagement, and it led me to think a lot about my own practice and the whole question of engaging and persisting. And one of the things that we began to see is that these three levels, these layers of feeling, material, and image making, all organize engagement. That when you're doing the arts, students are engaging on all three levels. And they're connecting on all three levels. And it leads me to think that the arts are a strong mechanism of connection. So the arts promote connection. Another thing that they offer that is really significant is the idea of communicating with an audience, and exhibits, and making exhibits. Because the students did so many exhibits, not just in their classroom, not just in the hallways, but in public spaces, in all kinds of meetings, presentations to the school board. There were many, many ways that they were preparing for an exhibit. This did so much to help develop their sense of themselves as an artist. And it did so much it intertwined with those connections. Because when they were envisioning, they were not just envisioning the work they would be doing, they were envisioning the response that they wanted the audience to have. So if we're talking about engagement, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is the role that internal verbalization plays in engagement. It plays a huge role. The fact that you are constantly having this internal conversation with yourself, looking at what you're doing and responding to what you are doing, and projecting it into the future and envisioning all of these things with this internal verbalization and assessing how you're using your materials. The fact that you're doing that is part of engagement. So no wonder students who don't know how to do this don't stay engaged. No wonder students who have never developed this internal verbalization get tired and quit. So internalization is part of staying engaged. It's also part of re-engaging. Because the best way to re-engage and persist is to start that process up again. To take another look at it and it kicks in. And now you're starting up that process again, and now you're engaged again. So that's why we came to think that internal verbalization is a mind tool to re-engage and persist, as well as a mind tool to keep engaged. Another thing that internal verbalization does is that it activates and reactivates and stays active and keeps active our connection to the process and problem solution. Disengagement, I think, is something that artists always have to deal with. You just can't do it today. Can't get back to it today. But in looking at what students said about when they got stuck, as they called it, how did they get going again? How did they solve the problem? They said that they got stuck because they didn't know what to do next. Or they didn't have a clear idea of what to do next. And the good thing about making art is that is so concrete. It's something that's so easy to share with somebody else. You know, a teacher can look and see right where they're getting stuck. A teacher can help them generate all kinds of ways of doing it and find out exactly where they are in their thinking, what's clear and what isn't. All of that is available to us. One of the things that I've been thinking about is how we can use the studio habits diagnostically. When we see somebody is stuck, we might ask, is it a problem of developed craft? If so, maybe we need to demonstrate. Is it a problem of observation? Well, maybe we need to make some more notation. Maybe we need to return to those sketchbooks. Is it a problem of envisioning? You can look at other students' work. That's often a good way for students to see exactly what it is they need and go back and put it to work. Is it a problem of expression? Do they just not have the feelings in that equation? Is that part of the triangle just not there? And so they don't have that message that they want to give. So the idea that I've come up with is that as we strengthen student skills in these other areas, we actually are strengthening engage and persist. They're going to be able to do it better because of all the skills in internal verbalization that they are picking up while they're using those other studio habits. So this got me thinking about my own internal verbalization in my work. And in just a couple of minutes, I came up with all of these ways that I am constantly doing that internal verbalization. And I have no doubt that other artists could come up with 10 times this in no time at all, because it is so much a part, a hidden part, that is central and critical to our work. In talking about engage and persist, I can't help but bring up the idea that problems with engage and persist aren't always about disengagement. Sometimes our problem is that we persist far longer than we should. Sometimes we ignore our biology, or we just forget that our minds need to rest. And I just want to bring that out for balance. Because once students get good at this problem will start to come up. Where they are at the beginning is getting all of this going. But once it's going, we shouldn't just go around patting ourselves on the back, because we should be looking carefully at other skills they need to mitigate and to disengage intentionally, and then have these skills to re-engage so that they can keep their minds and their bodies healthy. I see stretch and explore as the counterpart to engage and persist. I've been talking a lot today about critical thinking, but just as important, and for us as artists, more important probably, is creative thinking. And I could say much more about creative thinking than I am today about critical thinking. But it's the opposite. It's about being open-ended as well as moving toward a purpose. It's about stretching, challenging our normal art practice with new things while maintaining our skills. It's about exploring something new and not always using our familiar, comfortable skills and familiar materials. We create a working mental space that is an artifice. we've created it. And if you're not pushing out the edges of that space, it begins to shrink. So stretch and explore is about keeping that space open and flexible. So I want to focus now on metacognition and the idea that reflection is the quintessence of metacognition. You can almost use the two words interchangeably. So because we talked about that verbal internalization, that metacognition, it's obvious that reflection is a part of all of the studio habits. There are some things that we do that we call reflection as a studio habit, namely to look at our own work with a lens of reflection, using critical thinking and the work of others. And in that way, reflection is part of problem solving and also stretch and explore. So the last thing that I want to do is share with you an exercise that I did. I felt that I needed to know more about metacognition, and I needed to understand it more. And I had a hard time because I could not find anything that pulled it together. And then I came across this book, The Taxonomy of Metacognition, which, by the way, was a PhD dissertation by a young woman in Australia. But it has received rave reviews because it takes the research and the writing in metacognition, starting with the Greeks. Aristotle, Plato, they wrote a lot about metacognition, all the way through to present research, and then across all of the current scientific disciplines. So she united, everybody philosophically who talked about metacognition and everybody who scientifically has done experimental research on metacognition. And she identified a big problem, which is that there is no common vocabulary, that almost everybody who does research invents their own words. And I didn't feel so bad then that I didn't, and I suddenly realized why there wasn't this unified view of metacognition. So I had this idea that I would take the key words that I found through reading that whole book, which is very dense, and I would try to assign it to the studio habits of mind. And so that's what I've done here. So on the left, you see the studio habit of mind, and on the right, you see the words, and in some cases, some quotes this is how I saw them coming together. This was an exercise. This is not the result of a long study of it. And you may think that some of these words belong with another category. And certainly some of these words belong in more than one category. But what this gives us is an understanding of how other people, the vocabulary that other people use when they talk about these important ideas, so that we can communicate with other people about what we do. So that we can say that when we're doing development craft, our students are learning executive functions. They're learning how to regulate their use of materials. They're monitoring their own growth and development over time. They're learning how to control those materials and to control their own self as they do that. They learn how to make self-correction They learn how to do self-appraisal. And I love this quote, personal reflections about one's knowledge and abilities. That's all part of developed craft. That's how you spiral forward with developed craft, is through these processes.